እንኳን ወደ ሚዲያ በሰላም መጣችሁ። ጤና ይስጥልኝ። በቀጥታ ስርጭት አሁን የገባሁት የአውሮፓ ህብረትና የአሜሪካ ከፍተኛ የክብ ጠረጴዛ ውይይት ስለሚደረግ አሁን ከአንድ ደቂቃ በኋላ ይጀምራል። ወደዛ ነው የምንሄደው። በኋላ በኢስተርን ታይም 4 ሰዓት ላይ ወደ መተንተን እንመለሳለን። አሁን የቀጥታ ስርጭቱን ነው ቀጥታ የምናስተላልፈው። ከፊት ለፊት እንደምታዩት በሲኤንኤን ኢንተርናሽናል ኮረስፖንደንት በሆነችው ነው የሚመራው። የመግቢያውም ዋና ከፍተኛ ውይይቱን ወደ ኋላ እና ከዛ ተሳታፊዎች እንደምታዩት በአሜሪካ በተባበሩት መንግስታት የአሜሪካ አምባሳደር በሆኑት ይቀጥላል። እንኳን ደህና መጣችሁ መልእክት እየተዘጋጁ ነው። ወደዛ እንገባለን። ከዛ የአውሮፓ ህብረት የተለያዩ ኮሚሽነሮች አሉ። መጨረሻ መዝጊያ ንግግር የሚያደርጉት ፌልትማን ናቸው። የአሜሪካ መንግስት ልዩ ልዑክ ወደ አፍሪካ ቀንድ የሄዱት ማለት ነው። ወደዛ ወደ ቀጥታ ስርጭቱ ወስዳችኋለሁ። በኋላ እመለሳለሁ።
Will provide a much needed urgent push for the global conversation, but also for global action. So many of you who are watching from around the world who reached out to us have expressed the awfulness of the last few months. Those of you who want to go right for yourselves, for your families, to the survivors, you've expressed your heartbreak and your disappointment at what has felt like, in many of your words, an endless cycle of broken promises, empty threats, and a sense that help is forever out of reach. The hope is that today, perhaps, the work finally begins to deliver much of that much needed help, that no more will there be closed door meetings that come with not much of anything out of the UN Security Council, broken promises by Ethiopia and its ally Eritrea, but also actually finally action from the humanitarian community and the global push. It is my honor, my pleasure to be with you today as the host and to introduce the key speakers and the co-hosts. First and foremost, or I should say first and equals, is Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield has almost from day one been pushing on the humanitarian crisis in Tigray. She brings with her a weight of diplomatic experience, postings around the world for the United States, Director General of the Foreign Service, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Director of Human Resources, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration. Distinguished diplomatic career includes an ambassadorship to Liberia, postings in Switzerland at the United States Mission to the United Nations in Geneva, Pakistan, Kenya, the Gambia, Nigeria, and Jamaica. But in addition to all that, she's also been an avid and persistent proponent of the throwing open to the public of many of these closed-door UN Security Council meetings on Tigray. Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, the floor is yours.
Unmute the ambassador.
I can't do anything. I can't hear anyone. Hold on. I can't hear her on my end. Let me try again. But she's speaking. Is everything fine?
She's unmuted on her end. She cannot unmute herself. I think a moderator needs to unmute her. Or a host.
Oh, well, hold on. Which one is she on? So host, okay. Let me try again. How's that? No, I can't unmute anyone. I'm clicking on it and I cannot unmute anyone.
No,
Yeah.
she's unmuted. Okay.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes,
Ambassador,
you
you are.
Apologies
Apologies
for
for
those
those
technical
technical
details.
details.
Sorry about that. I guess that's where we'll start now is just by saying I feel like we've been muted for the past 7 months on Tigray. But again, where I started is to thank you, Nima, and to welcome everyone to the US-EU high-level roundtable on the humanitarian emergency. And I'm honored to be joined by my colleagues from the US government, the European Union, the United Nations, as well as civil society. I'm also saddened to be here today. I'm saddened by what has brought all of us into this room. On Monday, Reuters reported firsthand stories of victims in Tigray. One Tigrayan woman, a coffee seller in a Sudanese refugee camp, said an Ethiopian soldier gave her an ultimatum when he caught her fleeing her home. Either I kill you or I rape you. This report is just one of many we've heard over the past 6 months since this situation started. The humanitarian situation in Tigray is a moment of truth for the international community. Thousands of people in Ethiopia have been killed, injured, or horrifically abused or violated during this crisis. Hospitals, farms, and other vital infrastructure has been purposely destroyed. Millions have been forced to abandon their home, leading to what is a man-made humanitarian emergency. And I use that very explicitly, a man-made humanitarian emergency. This is unacceptable. Famine may already be happening in certain areas, threatening the lives of hundreds of thousands. It's unconscionable, especially in the very place that woke the modern world up to the scourge of hunger. The Ethiopian famine in the mid-1980s led to hundreds of thousands of people starving to death. We all remember the pictures that we saw of emaciated, starving people on CNN. Today, an estimated 90% of people in Tigray are now in desperate need of assistance. Hundreds of thousands more may be in famine conditions by September. A second failed harvesting season, which will very likely happen, would kill countless people. We are witnessing a humanitarian nightmare. This is not the kind of disaster that can be reversed. We cannot make the same mistake twice. We cannot let Ethiopia starve. We have to act now. And yet, despite the best efforts of many members of the Security Council, and sadly, due to the impediments placed in front of us by some council members, the council still has not yet held a single public meeting or taken necessary action to address the human rights and humanitarian crisis that we're witnessing. What are we afraid of? What are we trying to hide? The Security Council's failure is unacceptable. We have addressed other emergent crises with public meetings, but not with this one. So I ask those who refuse to address this issue publicly, do African lives not matter? It's time for the Security Council to have a public meeting on this issue. It's time for the Council to take meaningful action to address the crisis. And it's time for the Ethiopian government to respond responsibly to requests for humanitarian access, to end the fighting and hold those accountable for the violations that have occurred. It's time for the broader international communities to step up to and prevent another famine. Sadly, however, the current humanitarian response is woefully underfunded with shocking gaps in all sectors. So the United States, as the largest bilateral donor for the humanitarian response in Ethiopia, is calling on other donors to rapidly and collectively support the UN scale up. We need everyone's support for an urgent multi-sector response to meet basic needs, including food and nutrition, healthcare, shelter, protection, and clean water. As President Biden said in his statement last week, and will tell the G7 counterparts tomorrow, families of every background and ethnicity, every heritage deserve to live in peace and security. And political wounds cannot be healed through force of arms. After all, the backdrop of this devastating situation in Tigray is the unfolding historic transition in Ethiopia. If this political transition is to succeed, if it will indeed deliver a more prosperous future for Ethiopia's 110 million citizens, then the country's leaders must draw on the democratic aspirations of all Ethiopians. They must allow Ethiopians to come together through inclusive dialogue to build a shared vision for the country's future. And in the meantime, the international community must do our part to prevent suffering and to promote peace. The United States is committed to helping the Ethiopian people. And I look forward to hearing from today's distinguished speakers in the hopes that this event serves as a springboard for action and bring an end to the carnage that we're all witnessing day to day in Ethiopia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for those very strong and much needed words. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce the European Union Commissioner for Crisis Management, Janez Lenarčič, and the European Union Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen, and hopefully our technical difficulties have been resolved. So if we could unmute them as we mute the ambassador, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Commissioner Lenarčič serves as the European Union Commissioner for Crisis Management. He previously served as permanent representative of the Republic of Slovenia to the European Union, State Secretary for European and Foreign Affairs, and was a former director of the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights within the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Commissioner Urpilainen serves as the European Union Commissioner for International Partnerships. She was the first female chairman of the Social Democratic Party of Finland, which she led from 2008 to 2014. She was the Minister of Finance of Finland. She previously served as the Foreign Minister's Special Representative on Mediation and Chair of the National Commission on Sustainable Development. The commissioners are, of course, the co-hosts of today's roundtable. Commissioners, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nima. Excellencies, dear colleagues, it is a pleasure to be with you today and to co-host this roundtable together with the United States. And I wish to thank in particular USAID Administrator Samantha for co-hosting this important and timely event. 7 months into the conflict in Ethiopia's Tigray region, unspeakable atrocities continue to be reported. At the same time, the humanitarian crisis is reaching staggering levels. Several million of innocent people are being pushed to the brink. Since the fighting broke out last November, the European Commission has been repeatedly and consistently calling for end of hostilities, unconditional, full and unhindered humanitarian access, the respect of international humanitarian law and the obligation to protect civilians, as well as for the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean forces. While the Ethiopian authorities have committed to do so, the humanitarian crisis in Tigray has reached alarming proportions. Systematic violence is being inflicted upon civilians in a deliberate and coordinated manner. Widespread sexual violence, extrajudicial and ethnically motivated killings, destruction of the population's essential livelihood assets and health services, forced displacement, mass expropriation, and so on. On top of it, deliberate and repeated military hindrances and lootings of humanitarian assistance are driving the population into mass starvation. The developments unfolding in Tigray are evidently indicating an outstanding emergency, one that has potential to reach dimensions of preventable human suffering not seen in decades. To avoid a humanitarian catastrophe, the entire international community must act directly and indirectly, quickly and robustly. The magnitude and severity of human rights and humanitarian law violations taking place in Tigray is outrageous. Using starvation of civilians as a weapon of war constitutes a grave violation of international humanitarian law. I'm convinced that the entire international community must urgently act on the three following points. First, humanitarian assistance must be able to reach all those in need. It is essential that it does not become in any way conditional, irrespective of potential ceasefire or any other matter. Deliberate denying of humanitarian actors access on the ground must stop now. This is a matter of life or death for millions of people. Second, all parties to the conflict must do their utmost to ensure the protection of all civilians, whoever and wherever they are. This includes protecting them from hostilities, but also safeguarding their survival means. Ongoing atrocities against civilians must stop. And third, more than ever, a significant scale-up of our humanitarian funding response in support of the people affected by this conflict is urgently needed. Ladies and gentlemen, together with the United States, we have been the most generous humanitarian donor to Tigray to date. The European Commission will continue to play its part in this regard by demonstrating its solidarity with the people of Tigray. But despite growing humanitarian needs across different sectors, the international community's response to the unfolding emergency in Tigray continues to be largely insufficient, both from humanitarian and also from a political point of view. We cannot turn a blind eye to the aggravating humanitarian situation we are witnessing today, and for too many months now. The lives of millions of civilians in Tigray depend on our collective action. Thank you.
May I continue?
Yes, of course, Commissioner, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Nima. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm also very grateful to colleagues on both sides of the Atlantic for making today's roundtable possible. And definitely, we must urgently draw the world's attention on Tigray, Ethiopia. I personally visited Addis Ababa in December 2019 at the very beginning of my mandate as EU Commissioner for International Partnerships, together with the President von der Leyen. And this was a very great visit where we discussed with Ethiopian authorities our shared vision of hope and also of peace and development for the second most populous country of the Africa. And of course, the host of African Union. Unfortunately, today, Ethiopia is in a complex domestic situation with major implications for the greater Horn of Africa region. And this creates serious concern for the European Union. It is our duty to stand by the Ethiopian people who are suffering enormously. Commissioner Lenarčič made the humanitarian scenario crystal clear. What should we do as the international community to respond to such dramatic events? Everyone knows the starting point. We have been firm with the Ethiopian authorities, asking them to ensure full and unhindered humanitarian access to conduct an independent investigation on human rights violation. We have also called to cease all hostilities and for the effective retreat of Eritrean troops from Tigray as they fuel the conflict. Our calls for a concerted approach, unfortunately, have not worked so far. And I regret the lack of progress in accepting a ceasefire. But we all know that there are no military solutions. We must redouble efforts to make our requests heard. And I see two options. Firstly, continuous pressure on those responsible. And secondly, reaching those in need. Since the onset of the conflict, the EU has postponed budget support payments. At the same time, we did not suspend our cooperation projects, and we continue supporting people in need and leave no one behind. In doing so, we stand firm on our values, the first of which being human dignity and well-being. There are 120 million Ethiopians, out of them 70% are youth, who are really looking to us for support and opportunities. Our commitment to them is not up for discussion. As Team Europe, we mobilized 487 million euros for Ethiopia's COVID response. We are assessing together with the EU member states how to put more pressure and adapt to the evolving situation. So, dear friends, we heard humanitarian figures for Tigray. There are thousands of lives destroyed. The whole social fabric of Ethiopia is shaken. Equally, it is the country's political structure at risk on the eve of general elections, as well as its economic outlook. Tigray accounts for only 6% of the Ethiopian economy, but damages might go well beyond. Trust is key for investment, and a decline in foreign direct investment flows can have far-reaching impacts, slowing down post-COVID recovery. Finally, I want to raise everyone's attention to the broader Horn of Africa region. What happens in Ethiopia does not stay in Ethiopia. Most immediately, as there are foreign troops operating in Ethiopia. We are still waiting the announced withdrawal of Ethiopian troops from Tigray to happen. As recalled by Commissioner Lenarčič, 20,000 Eritrean refugees are still unaccounted for. Many more Ethiopian nationals are now in Sudan. And this is why Sudan also deserves our full attention. Its fragile democratic transition needs to be protected. But border tensions with Ethiopia and lack of agreement around the Great Ethiopian Residence Dam are a great concern. Other bordering countries, Somalia and South Sudan, are in a situation of fragility too. So we need Ethiopia as a force of stability and integration for the region. Ladies and gentlemen, I seize this opportunity to ask the international community to work together with Ethiopians towards peace for the people of the country and the whole Horn region. And definitely, the EU will continue to stand by the Ethiopian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Really important message there, not only about the situation in Ethiopia itself, but about the potential for contagion across the region. Now, it is my pleasure to turn to Administrator Samantha Power, Administrator of the United States Agency for International Development. Prior to joining the Biden-Harris administration, Administrator Power was a professor at Harvard University. During the Obama-Biden administration, she served as the 28th US representative to the United Nations and Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for multilateral affairs and human rights on the National Security Council. She also brings to those roles within the administration's years of advocacy and years of sitting on my side of the fence, reporting as a war correspondent in Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, Sudan, and Zimbabwe. And from very early on, the administrator was ringing alarm bells, was tweeting out even ahead of her formal confirmation hearings about the concern for Tigray. So it's a pleasure to give her the floor. Administrator Power.
Thank you, Nima, so much, not only for your introduction, but for lending your precious time and your voice to draw attention to the tremendous suffering in Tigray. I also want to thank my friend Linda, Ambassador Thomas-Greenfield, for her remarks and all she has been doing to move heaven and earth in New York so we can force action in Ethiopia. And Linda, I will say, having had your job once, I've lived through great frustration on the Security Council when we are blocked and can't secure, for example, a tough resolution on an issue of grave concern. I don't know that I've ever lived through what you're living through, which is people not even being willing to come together to put an issue of this gravity on the agenda, an issue of such severity, not even to have a formal meeting on something of this enormity. It's shocking, truly, and will go down in history really as a very shameful period. Really grateful to my commissioner co-hosts Janez and Jutta. I had a chance to meet with both of them yesterday, and I'm grateful for the leadership that they have consistently shown to raise the alarm since the conflict began in November. It is so easy when discussing humanitarian emergencies, even one of, again, the scale and scope of the catastrophe we face in Tigray, to get lost in the scale of the suffering. So I want to start by sharing with you the story of a Tigrayan woman I'll call Atsede. Atsede is 35 years old, a mother of 4 children, who is now pregnant with her 5th, who lived in Tigray. On November 9th of last year, her neighbor came to her to warn her that armed groups allied with the Ethiopian government were close by. But by the time the soldiers arrived the next day, it was too late. She tried to flee, separated from her family, but soldiers captured her and put her on a bus. She was taken to a nearby village where a week later, more soldiers arrived and more chaos followed. Soldiers began calling out names of the captured Tigrayans, separating the men and women and sending them off to yet another village. But Atsede's name was not called. Instead, after the buses departed, she was left behind with several other women, tied up to a pole, and this young woman, separated from her family, was raped by 5 soldiers before passing out from the trauma. Atsede's story is heartbreaking, but it is not unique. Since the conflict erupted last fall between forces of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and those allied with the Ethiopian government, reports of the systemic attempt to use rape and gender-based violence as weapons of war have been almost too grim and too rife to bear. The scale of those crimes and the reports of the soldiers' conduct and testimony suggest that the Ethiopian military, together with their allies in the Eritrean military and forces from the Amharan region, have launched a campaign to shatter families and destroy the reproductive and mental health of their victims. And many survivors have nowhere to turn for help. Although Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has frequently cut off power and mobile phone access to the region, we know that the forces allied to the Ethiopian government have damaged and looted health facilities, leaving only an estimated 16% of them still working today. Soldiers have also razed factories to disrupt the local economy and even damaged some of the oldest mosques and churches in all of Africa. There are widespread reports of massacres, and sadly, things may soon get worse. As we've heard, a famine is looming in Ethiopia, the first in over 30 years, threatening the lives of hundreds of thousands. In fact, it may have already begun. An estimated 5.2 million people in Tigray are in desperate need of food assistance in a state of just 6 million people. And hundreds of thousands of them are facing catastrophic food insecurity. Make no mistake, again, as has been said, this famine is man-made. In addition to destroying critical cultural and economic infrastructure, the armies of Ethiopia and Eritrea have laid waste to Tigray's food supply. In order to feed their families, farmers need to plow their fields and sow seeds ahead of the annual June rains, which are beginning now. But the government of Ethiopia's military allies have burned and looted seeds and farm equipment and slaughtered oxen to ensure that the fields lay fallow. So determined are they to eliminate livelihoods that some have reportedly crushed baby chicks under their boots. These same forces have threatened, intimidated, detained, and even killed aid workers attempting to feed the hungry. I spent much of yesterday speaking with the leaders of humanitarian organizations working in Tigray, some of whom we'll hear from in the panel that follows. Many of these individuals are veterans of decades of devastating food crises and conflicts. And yet nearly all of them told me the same thing, that the nature of this conflict, the combination of gender-based violence, widespread conflict, and the threat of starvation and famine has led to the worst humanitarian conditions they have ever witnessed. It is time, it is well past time for action. In 2019, Prime Minister Abiy was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work to end Ethiopia's longstanding war with Eritrea. But unless he ends the violence, ensures the withdrawal of Eritrean forces, and allows humanitarian workers unfettered access to people in need, revisiting famine upon Ethiopia will be his legacy. The United States recently announced visa restrictions and limits to economic and security aid to the government of Ethiopia, a serious step against a long-standing partner. And yesterday, we announced $181 million in new humanitarian aid, bringing the total that we've supplied since the start of the Tigray crisis to nearly $500 million. But none of this is enough. More resources are needed. And condemnation requires a chorus. That's why today's event is so important, so that we can all speak with one voice about our commitment to the people in Tigray, so that we can demand together that Prime Minister Abiy bring an end to the suffering in the region. As Linda mentioned, the member states of the UN Security Council, particularly its African members, must move to support putting this crisis on the Council's agenda, to press Abiy to agree to a ceasefire, to rein in Ethiopia's Eritrean and Amharan allies, to remove the physical and bureaucratic roadblocks that currently leave 1 million people beyond the reach of humanitarian aid. In addition to complete access, aid workers also need long-term visas and telecommunications equipment, and they need to carry out their life-saving work free of harassment and violence. And ultimately, all parties involved must agree to a negotiated peace that finally ends this catastrophe. My colleague Jeff Feltman, our special envoy, will speak to this at the close of today's proceedings. Atsede, the young woman I spoke to you about, has luckily reached safe harbor. She's currently in a facility in Tigray run by Save the Children, where she can receive the medical attention and psychological care that she needs. But she, like many of Tigray's residents, is adrift, unsure of where her husband is and whether all her children are accounted for. She's also about to deliver a child on her own. As she put it, I assume my husband and 2 other children are in Sudan, but they may also be dead, she said. I don't know. I don't know. All of us here today, we will never get to say we don't know. We know what is happening in Tigray, despite the complex nature of the conflict and the attempts at obfuscation by the Ethiopian government. And with that knowledge comes a duty to do all we can to end it, for the sake of long-term peace and stability in the region, for the sake of the people of Tigray who have seen such suffering, for the sake of women like Atsede. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Administrator Power. it's true. We can't say we don't know, but we're already hearing from so many Tigrayans online, and what they're saying is it's not enough just to know. The world now has to act. So thank you so much for your words. Next, we are going to our distinguished panel, beginning with Samantha Lowcock, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator of the UN. He has 30 years of experience leading and managing responses to humanitarian crises around the world, and previously served as the Permanent Secretary at the United Kingdom Department for International Development, DFID. We're also joined by Jan Egeland, the Secretary General for the Norwegian Refugee Council. He has previously served as the Special Advisor to the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, and the UN Secretary General for Conflict Prevention and Resolution, UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, State Secretary of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Secretary General of the Norwegian Red Cross. Pramila is the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict. Prior to this appointment, she served as a member of the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against. She's been a member of several high-level panels and projects, including the high-level advisory group for the global study on the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security, and the advisory panel for the African Women's Rights Observatory within the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining us. I'd like to start with Mark Lowcock. Mark, I'm sure you've seen the Reuters reporting on some of the internal IPC data on famine, and an as yet unreleased report on the IPC data for Ethiopia. And the numbers are awful, as these numbers always are, no matter how high or low they are. Any community in famine is appalling, and I've heard you say that in the past. But these numbers are something in the region of 350,000 people. And this is the first time we've had some semblance of an actual tangible figure. There's always been a sense among aid workers that what's happening out in that we don't know what we don't know and how bad it is out there. So are these numbers, are they actually what you're seeing? Is the 350,000 correct? And what needs to be done to stop those numbers growing?
Well, thank you very much, Nima, and thank you to the organisers. And I hope you'll just bear with me for a couple of minutes on the question you've asked me, because I can tell you, because it's been released now, what is in the IPC report. I can tell you what it means, and I can tell you what we need to do about it. And let me just start by saying the IPC is a consortium of UN agencies, leading analytical think tanks, NGOs. This is the most authoritative, sophisticated, detailed, reliable assessment that's used anywhere in the world at every time when there's a food security crisis. In the case of northern Ethiopia, a very detailed survey has been done. It's covered 83 out of 90 warraders. The coverage deals not just with extreme situations in Tigray, but in neighboring areas as well, Amhara and Afar. So what does this report tell us? Well, it paints a picture of a very, very extreme situation. There is famine now. There is famine now in Tigray. The number of people in famine conditions, in IPC 5 conditions, is higher than anywhere in the world at any moment since 250,000 Somalis lost their lives in 2011. There's another 2 million people just a step away from those extreme situations. And they include people in Afar and Amhara as well as in Tigray. The next thing the report tells us is that these people are in multiple locations. They're in at least 5 distinct areas across a wide part of Tigray, the people in famine conditions. The next thing it tells us is that some of those people are in hard to reach areas, which means we basically have no access to them. But some of them are in partially accessible places, which means some days we can get to them. And some of those people are actually in places we can reach. Now those findings are very, very important, because I'm going to come on to the access problem, but already we could be reaching more of those more of those people with current access availability. And then the last thing the report tells us is this is going to get a lot worse. You know, as you say, unfortunately, I've been doing this work for a long time. My first job was dealing with the huge famine in Ethiopia in the mid-1980s. And every expert you speak to will tell you this is going to get a lot worse. And that will have wide ramifications and long-lasting ramifications. Now, what do we do about this? Well, there's only three things we need to do. We need to improve the access, we need to scale up the operational capacity of the agencies, and we need more money. So on access, the central problem is that control of the affected areas is split between the Ethiopian government, who I think are trying to reach people they can. With our help, they've reached 2 million people across parts of the affected areas. But unfortunately, that's 2 million out of 5.5 million. There are many people caught in areas controlled essentially by Eritrean soldiers. There are many people caught in areas which are under the control of Amhara militias. And there are some people, about 1 million or so probably, who are in areas controlled by the Tigrayan opposition. Now, all of those groups are responsible for access violations. I can tell you, Nima, that we count every access violation, we document it, and we identify who the perpetrators are. And an hour ago, I received the latest assessment we have of access violations for the whole of May in the affected areas. There were 131 incidents which involve things like the interrogation, assault and detention of aid workers by men in uniforms. Now, of those 131 incidents, 50 were identified as having been perpetrated by Eritrean soldiers, 54 by Ethiopian soldiers, 4 by a combination of Eritrean and Ethiopian soldiers, 21 by Amhara militias, and 1 by Tigrayan opposition forces. So everybody, all of those groups need to improve their behavior. I want to say something about operational capacity, because there's a huge need, because of the tragic disappearance in much of the affected areas of Ethiopia's own institutions, to scale up the operational capacity of the agencies. And Antonio Guterres, my boss, brought together all of the operational agencies on Monday. And we're working very hard on scaling up our security capability, but also our operational capability. And it's very, very important that we bring in more staff and more capable staff, and all the agencies are on the case on that. And then the third thing we need is money. And thank you, Administrator Power, because the United States indeed has provided leadership. Thank you for the announcement you made in today's meeting. I do have to tell everybody that some of the most important agencies have essentially no money at the moment. So I hope for newly available money, there will be allocations, including to the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, and the International Organization for Migration, because those agencies have capacity which can't be used because they don't have enough money at the moment. I want, lastly, if I may, Nima, just to try to say something about what a famine is and what it means when there is this kind of extreme situation. The story Administrator Power told about Adetse, I've heard many stories of people like that. But I want to tell you something about what happens to the human body in the process of starvation. When people have no body, your metabolism slows down. That's to preserve energy for your vital organs. People often become fatigued and irritable and confused. Your immune system loses strength. So as they starve, people become likelier to fall sick from diseases they might have staved off otherwise, and they die from those diseases, whether it's cholera or COVID or malaria or dengue or just the common cold. For people who manage to escape disease but find nothing to eat, their vital organs start to wither and then fail, and eventually the body devours its own muscles, including the heart. Many people at this stage experience hallucinations and convulsions before finally their heart stops. This is a terrible, agonizing, and humiliating death. It is going to happen to a lot of people. unless the things I've talked about are done. And that is particularly cruel in a world like ours, where there is in fact more than enough food for everyone. This is a solvable problem, and we really have to solve it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. I just want to pick up on what you need from the international community. So you need money. As you said, it was wonderful. It's wonderful to hear the announcement of more funds from USAID, but you need more money, clearly what you're saying, from everyone. But in addition to that, one of the key themes that's emerged is the UN Security Council not formally putting this on the public agenda. And when you speak about access, that's the kind of enforcement that has to come from the international community. We were in Ethiopia, I should say, to be very clear, we were in Ethiopia in April, and we saw for ourselves, we captured Eritrean soldiers obstructing aid access. That was back in April. So as Administrator Power was saying, we can't say we don't know, we do. What do you need from the UN Security Council to ensure that these issues of obstruction end?
Well, you know, in 2018, the Security Council passed a resolution called 2417, which instructs me and the Secretary General to tell the Council every time we're worried about a conflict leading to a major food security problem. And up to 3 months ago, I had followed those instructions on, I think, 3 occasions. And because there were 3 occasions where I thought that, and the Secretary General, I thought that was the situation we faced. Now, each time we sent the message to the Council, it's called a white paper, a white note in our jargon, the Council had an open meeting, so everybody could discuss the issues. That has not happened this time. I don't understand why. I have to say, I don't understand why. What's the point of passing a resolution if you're not going to take up the powers you've given yourself?
Because it's such an extraordinary point you're raising. So the way that this works is you put forward the white paper, you do your job, you and your agency do your job, and the Council is supposed to have, the UN Security Council is supposed to have an open meeting to discuss the report that you've put forward. And on Tigray, this has not happened on the 3 occasions that you've done this.
Yes, I've briefed the Council privately so far on 3 occasions. I've been invited to go back for another private meeting, I understand, on Tuesday next week. But I think what the Council has always done previously is have an open meeting. It's obviously up to Council members. I mean, we are the servants of the Council. But my question to them is, what's the point of passing a resolution and asking for information if you then don't have a discussion about it? And the discussion has turned out in the past to be valuable and important, and it's helped us deal with problems because, and it's transparent, which I think is an important issue, but it's also helped us deal with the problem because Council members have talked about it in public and then in private, and they've worked out things they can do, especially on the insecurity problem and the access problem, which is, you know, that's the biggest challenge we face now in northern Ethiopia.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think this is probably one of the last times that we're going to be seeing you speaking publicly. I hope we'll see you in some other capacity, but thank you so much for joining the panel today. I turn now to Jan Egeland. Jan, you've heard what Mark had to say, and from your position sitting in the in the NGO sector, so kind of parallel to the UN agencies, what do you think in a more broader way humanitarian organizations need integrate to help end the suffering? We've heard about the need for money. So my question to you is, do you need more money? I'm sure you always need more money. But in addition to that, what do you think you need from the international community to push for increased humanitarian access in Tigray?
We need a number of things. And clearly, it is urgent. But I'm also, clearly hopeful today that perhaps we will end the talk and we will start the operations now, the action now. There are thousands of humanitarian workers now in and around Tigray ready to act. It can change in the next weeks. I'm hopeful, but I'm also a little bit doubtful because you said you discussed this in April. it's 220 days since it started in November. NRC, we had nearly 100 aid workers in Tigray when this started. They were there attending to serving Eritrean refugees that Ethiopia generously hosted. We lost contact with them overnight in November. Something terrible was happening. I went myself in November to the end November to the Sudanese Ethiopian border and received there with colleagues thousands and thousands fleeing the violence in November, continued in December. So it's 220 days. Today we need action. So indeed, we need three things really. We need the famine prevention ceasefire, an end to the violence, an end to armed men all over areas where civilians are hungry, suffering in famine. And I think the concept again of a famine prevention ceasefire, famine prevention end to violence is a stronger one, because it's not, well, the other side did this, so we have to do that. They are killing children with their continued violence, their roadblocks, their military offensives that are happening as we speak. Secondly, we need unimpeded access. So what is access? Is that we can roll, we can go, we can get there when people need us in their hour of greatest need. It's not rocket science. It's very clear what unimpeded access is. And finally, we need a fully funded appeal. Yes. So I think Mark Lowcock is correct. There are some money for some organizations. There are operations scaling up, but many of us are underfunded and overstretched. Of course, we also need the work permits, the partnership with the Ethiopian government that we have enjoyed in so many places over recent years. We have been able to meet the needs of millions in Ethiopia before. Many times, Ethiopia has an efficient system. We need that system to partner with us to help the Tigrayans.
Well, you are a veteran, unfortunately, I should say, of so many of these different crises. I know you from the work that you did in Darfur, because I was reporting on it at the time, and it felt like similarly the world took far too long to act, or at least far too long to actually act, as opposed to speak. And I'd just like to go back to what we are continuing to hear on social media, and I'm being messaged by a lot of Tigrayans in the diaspora. It is, for many of them, they say, wonderful and reassuring to finally hear what they've been hearing from their families and seeing for themselves said on this kind of an international stage. But they say words are no longer enough. From your perspective, slightly outside of the multilateral system, from the UN perspective, what would you like to see if you could write down something tomorrow to come out of the UN Security Council? What would you want?
Well, I would like to see the Security Council act as a Security Council, really, which is to deal with the biggest and most urgent crisis on our watch and solve them. Among the things we always need in these kind of situations is like a diplomatic situations room, a diplomatic operations room, where the various actors mobilize other diplomats, donors, people of influence to solve the various issues. I've listed the end to the violence, the ceasefire, the access restrictions, the work permits, the scale up, the restoration of all telecommunication services, the restoration of transport lines, the restoration of air traffic, the restoration of services in general to this last region. So I would say the US and the EU did their bit today by calling this high-level meeting that has mobilized attention, will mobilize funding, will mobilize the donor scene. We need others to step forward on these other issues. But back again, we are guests in Ethiopia. We need to partner with Ethiopian institutions to be able to work full scale in Ethiopia. In November, we wrote letters to everybody on this, predicting this in November. I'm happy we're having this today. I'm saying today there are other regions in Ethiopia which are in nearly equal dire straits, with lack of access, with people suffering beyond belief. We need also operations and scale up there.
Thank you, Jan. I turn now to Pramila. Now, Pramila, we have reported on rape being used as a weapon of war. We've spoken to some extraordinarily brave women and men who have been supporting these women in the atrocities that they are surviving, and still, you know, surviving. From what we hear from so many of these survivors is that surviving it's an active process. You continue to survive every single day. And one of the questions that we have had coming into us, including from a colleague at Bloomberg, Samuel Gebre, who has reported extensively on Ethiopia, is we still don't really know so much of what's happening on the ground. We still don't have any concrete numbers. Can you give us a sense of what is happening? Do you have any numbers, any sense of how extensive, of how far-reaching this epidemic of sexual violence is?
Nima, let me start by congratulating you personally on your very bold reporting on the situation of women in the Tigray region. Too often the world views war as the theater of men, but you were able to bring the spotlight on the greater cries picked by women and girls behind the scenes, and to depict how their bodies were used by battlefields. News headlines may fade, but the crisis in Tigray into its 7 months is likely to remain a protracted crisis, and sexual violence against women and girls perpetrated by all parties to the conflict unfortunately continue unabated, both in terms of scale and brutality. My office has been following closely the situation in Tigray since November. I issued a statement on the 21st of January 2021, urging all parties involved in the fighting to adhere to a zero-tolerance policy for crimes of sexual violence. Already at that time, I had received disturbing reports from multiple and credible sources about a high number of rapes in the capital, Mekele, of individuals allegedly forced to rape members of their own family under threats of imminent violence. Some women had also reported being forced by military elements to have sex in exchange for food. Now, with more humanitarian actors, service providers allowed into the region, horrific stories of sexual violence are pouring in, and desperate women are coming forward with the most painful stories of how they have been sexually violated and tortured by soldiers of the Ethiopian and Eritrean army. And they report rape in front of family members, including their children, relatives forced to perpetrate rape, as well as gang rape by soldiers over multiple days. And women and girls being raped are reportedly aged between 8 and 72. It is true that not all of these allegations are UN verified. My position is that we cannot ignore these accounts of sexual atrocity. Sexual violence is one of history's greatest silence and one of the most underreported crimes. And you know that it takes great courage for any woman to speak about her experience of rape. And in a conservative society such as Ethiopia, in traditional and conservative families and communities, it takes great courage to share the most intimate and agonizing details about one's sexual ordeal. You've asked me a question about data. It's true that I don't have hard data to share with you, but I can tell you that service providers continue to signal an increased demand for sexual and reproductive health services, particularly emergency contraceptives, abortion and HIV prevention drugs, as well as increased requests for psychological and mental health support to deal with trauma resulting from sexual violence. And UNFPA has recently estimated that 22,500 women would require support as a consequence of conflict-related sexual violence. And these are all indicators of sexual violence being deployed on a large scale. Let me share with you something. Next week on the 17th of June, I'm launching a digital book entitled, in their own words, The Voices of Survivors of Conflict-Related Sexual Violence and Service Providers, to commemorate the International Day on the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. I have received a heart-wrenching testimony of a psychologist who works as a frontline responder. She gives harrowing details about both the scale and brutality of the sexual violence. And among other cases, she shared details of a 45-year-old woman recently gang raped by 16 Eritrean soldiers in front of her two sons. Yes, 16 Eritrean soldiers. And another 32-year-old woman gang raped on the same date by 14 Eritrean soldiers. Over to you.
Well, I mean, it's this testimony just continues to grow, and it's never not shocking to hear. But one of the concerns that so many of these women have raised is that it is not, I mean, you had a very interesting phrase there, that so many of these cases are not UN verified. And much of the concern of the women and their families and their communities is in the absence of access. Access seems to be the key theme here, and the absence of access to so many of these areas. What is the hope for justice? Is there some hope that, you were talking about this extraordinary sounding digital book. You are clearly, there is some form of collation of these testimonies. But if there is no way to pull together the evidence with regards to whatever judicial process potentially, hopefully can come, what would you say to these women who worry that justice will not come?
Well, let me share with you that in terms of national ownership, it must be acknowledged that some of the incidents of sexual violence have actually been documented by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, whose focus on this problem continues to be critical. For example, in its report in February 2021, the Commission documented a total of 108 cases. And the report indicated that the number of sexual violence incidents are likely to be higher and more widespread given the destruction of local structures where survivors could previously have reported violations, such as police stations and health facilities. In this regard, I'm glad that the joint investigation between the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has begun, and that sexual violence is one of the priority areas being investigated. And this could be instrumental in shedding further light on incidents and those responsible. I must say that across most of the situations covered under my mandate, a persistent and fundamental challenge to an effective response is the deep-rooted culture of denial of sexual violence. And in this case, I am encouraged by the explicit recognition of the government of Ethiopia that sexual violence has taken place in the Tigray region. And this includes, for example, the Minister of Women, Children and Youth Affairs, with whom I'm engaging very closely, who in January acknowledged that rape happened conclusively and without a doubt, and who established a task force to investigate allegations of sexual violence. Last week, the Office of the Ethiopian Federal Attorney General has also announced that criminal charges have been filed against 53 soldiers accused of killing and raping civilians in Tigray. The Attorney General specifically indicated that military prosecutors have pressed charges against 25 soldiers suspected of committing acts of sexual violence. Trials of these suspects are underway, and I understand that there have been 4 convictions. The Attorney General additionally indicated that his office is currently investigating several hundreds instances of alleged rape in Tigray, thus recognizing the scale of violations committed. And as I said, confronting the problem head on is a first and critical step. And I must say that my office has been closely engaged with the Ethiopian authorities, particularly the Minister of Women, Children and Youth Affairs and the team, to develop a framework of cooperation to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. And a draft is already with the minister and her team. Such an agreement would serve as a basis for the support of my office and the UN system to national authorities to implement a comprehensive prevention and response strategy, including the work begun by the Office of the Attorney General. And such a framework of cooperation covers the component of justice and accountability. And maybe I'll take this opportunity, Nima, as one concrete outcome of today's exchange. I wish to solicit the support of all the friends and partners of Ethiopia around this table in encouraging the national authorities to conclude and ratify the framework of cooperation, which is prepared in line with the resolutions of the Security Council on Women, Peace and Security and Sexual Violence in Conflict. And I really believe that it will require political commitment at the highest level, especially to ensure that all the necessary institutions come to the table, including the justice, security and health sectors.
I think reassuringly, Jeffrey Feltman, the Special Envoy for the US for the Horn of Africa, is of course giving the concluding remarks. So it's very clear that the Special Envoy was listening closely there, that is something actionable that both the European Union and the United States can press for. That, you know, so is that your ask from the international community? Tangibly, this is what could allow you to change the lives of these survivors now?
Very much so. And I also understand that Ethiopia will be among the issues discussed in the context of the G Summit starting tomorrow. And I think political visibility at that level, as well as the possibility of some resource commitments to support Ethiopia to institute a comprehensive response to conflict-related sexual violence, including through the framework of cooperation that I have mentioned, could be decisive. And my second request is therefore addressed to representatives of the G7 here today for the prevention of CRSV to be reflected in the summit outcome, particularly resource commitment to support national response effort. And this will actually build on a long-standing commitment of the forum to this issue, whereby the ministers of the then G8 issued a declaration on preventing sexual violence in conflict in April 2013, recognizing that the G8 has an important role in promoting conflict prevention and resolution, including through advancing the implementation of the relevant UN Security Council resolutions on women, peace and security. And Nima, when we talk about sexual violence in conflict, we're talking about it is preventable. It's not an inevitable byproduct. Thank you.
Absolutely. You know, as you just said, too often we know going into these conflicts that it's, you know, as you put it so poignantly, that it's women's bodies who become the battlefield. So it's a really important point to remember that this is preventable. We always look back at the end, but it's important to put our hands up now and say, we know it's preventable. Thank you so much. I just have time for one last question to the whole panel. So I will start at the beginning again with Mark. If you had one message to send to the international community from this roundtable here today, Mark, what would it be?
Well, the worst can still be avoided, and it won't be unless different action is taken now. A rerun of what happened in 1984 in Ethiopia would have very wide-ranging, long-lasting, deep and dire ramifications. So my message is, don't go there.
Act now. Thank you. Jan, what would be your message to the world? If you had one urgent message, what would it be?
It is to allow us as humanitarian workers to go to all corners of Tigray, to stay and deliver. I mean, when we talk about sexual violence and so on, which is so horrific, one of the ways of preventing it is to be there, to be witnesses and so on. So all of this now happens because there are millions who are without reach. They haven't seen a representative of the humanitarian world yet. Some have seen us every day for months. We haven't even been there. So enable us to do our work. Ethiopia can, as a very efficient government, the international community can unite to put pressure. We can do it. It can change now. And then final point is, let's also remember those places we're not discussing today, where we do not have access either, and where also bad things happen. In Ethiopia, we often concentrate on only one crisis at the time. We should concentrate on all of these crises in Ethiopia and beyond. Thank you.
Apologies, I was muted. I muted myself. Both the European Union commissioners brought up this point about regional contagion, and you said you visited the camps here in Sudan, in addition to, of course, the work that the Norwegian Refugee Council is doing in Tigray itself. How worried are you about the contagion effect from a humanitarian perspective? We have Sudan in its own shaky democratic transition, economically in a very difficult situation. The UNHCR, and actually I think I will go back to Mark quickly with that question with regards to being underfunded, and its support for those camps has been a real point of concern. How worried are you about the potential for this humanitarian crisis to cross the border and go into Sudan if enough action isn't taken?
Well, it already has done, Nima, as you know. I mean, thousands of Ethiopians crossed the border months ago. I think UNHCR did a really good job with the other agencies scaling up to meet their needs. UNHCR does need more money. I'm hoping next week to release a bit more money from the Central Emergency Response Fund, and they're one of the organisations who will be looking at there. But the Central Emergency Response Fund, which I manage myself, is a small fund and fast running out of money. So, you know, we really do need everybody to step up and allocate quickly what is available.
And again, Sudan itself has been for years underfunded as a crisis. So you now have this kind of toxic nexus of how much is the spillover from Ethiopia, and so therefore how much is that kind of within that budget, and how much now, especially with the economic instability here, is something that you need to be thinking about with regards to the host communities. What would you say to the international community with regards to, as the commissioners themselves said, not forgetting Sudan, not forgetting the impact into the neighboring countries that are now hosting these refugees?
Well, I've been traveling to Sudan for 40 years, actually. I'm too old, really. And for most of that time, Sudan was a country constantly in crisis. For the last 2 or 3 years, they've been pulling themselves up to a better position, thanks to decisions by US administrations. They're now on a path to debt relief. So there is a prospect of a better opportunity and better lives for people of Sudan. But if they're dragged down by this new set of problems and by ongoing problems in Darfur and elsewhere, those hopes will be dashed. So I agree with what Jan said. We need to deal with this problem, but not by not by taking our eye off the ball of other problems.
Sorry, and Jan, I cut you off as you were answering. Back to you.
No, not at all. I mean, it was heartbreaking to sit in Rakuba camp and see thousands running over the border to a place that bears the name of the previous Ethiopian famine. Rakuba means the huts, and now it's filled again. What we need is to help these people back. No, I'm not preparing for a bigger crisis. I'm preparing for solving this crisis. They need to come back in safety, in dignity. There must be people all over Tigray looking at what is happening. Protection should be a middle name in all of this. And I'm hopeful. Let's hope it turns today, really, because now it's 220 days and nights. And let's hope we can also have an eye on these other regions where we have we're even more overstretched and underfunded at the moment because there is a scale out. I know there are 2,000 aid workers in or at the border to Tigray ready to go in.
Thank you, Jan. Pramila, you've spoken about what you need with regards to your kind of immediate short-term need from the international community to support and lobby the Ethiopian government to allow your people the access they need. What more would you, if you had a message for the international community now, what would it be?
Well, first, Nima, I would really like to endorse what Jan has said, that we have to be mindful of the increasing armed conflict and intercommunal violence across the country, and the potential for further violence in Tigray, Oromia, Amhara, Benishangul, Gumuz, and in the southern nations, nationalities, and peoples region. And also want to flag the high levels of internal displacement, especially women and children who are extremely vulnerable to more sexual violence. The continuous displacement coupled with the food insecurity, a lack of basic services and food shelter and sanitation further increase the risk of gender-based violence, including sexual violence, and substantial efforts are required to reach all IDPs. Last word, I would say that words are not enough to make the suffering of women and children stop. Condemnation is important, but it's not enough to make families sleep soundly tonight and beyond in Tigray. The world, the international community knows what is happening in Tigray. We do not need to wait until we are able to conduct full and thorough investigation before we stop rape as a weapon of war. And similarly, we should not have to count the graves of men, women, and children before we act to stop starvation. Resolution 1325 and a series of resolution on conflict-related sexual violence, as well as Resolution 2417, which Mark mentioned, will remain meaningless pieces of paper unless the world acts on their solemn commitments. And there must be concerted and coordinated international pressure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all three of our distinguished panelists. It's been such an honor discussing your concerns and your issues. You are the people on the front lines. You are the people who know what you need. And it sounds like what you need is leadership at the highest global levels. Thank you so much for joining us and being so frank and so stark. It's now my pleasure to introduce the United States Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, the man tasked perhaps by the United States administration for turning some of these words into actions, Ambassador Jeffrey Feltman, for his closing summation. Ambassador Feltman was appointed the US Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa in April 2021. In this role, he is charged with leading a US diplomatic effort to address the interlinked political, security, and humanitarian crises in the Horn of Africa. Ambassador Feltman has had a distinguished career serving as the United Nations Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs, the Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to the UN Secretary General, following a long career in the United States Foreign Service. Ambassador Feltman, we've heard both from Tigrayans on social media, but also hear from those leading at the front line of the humanitarian assault on this crisis, that words are not enough, that action is needed. I give you the floor for the summation.
Thank you very much, Nima, and thanks to everyone who has spoken before me. I certainly learned a lot of details about a horrific situation in Tigray, as well as references to the broader tensions in Ethiopia and challenges in the Horn more generally. Nima, you mentioned that the message that you're hearing from the speakers from the panel and before is the need for global leadership. And as Pramila noted, the G7 will meet tomorrow. Start its meeting tomorrow, and the G7 has Ethiopia on its agenda. These are leaders who can set the global agenda for many issues around the world, and they have decided that this is a sufficiently important issue that Ethiopia will be discussed at the G7. This is something that I hope will get the attention of all of those that are promoting the fighting, the catastrophe, the famine on the ground. it's not something that they should be proud of. They should realize how concerned the G7 leaders are of all the issues in the world. This one is on the agenda. And picking up on Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield's opening comments, as well as some references by Mark Lowcock to 24/17 and beyond, this is an issue that should be on the Security Council agenda, and it's shameful that so far there's not been a public session. If we talk about 24/17, starvation is being used as a weapon of war. If we talk about the Women, Peace, and Security resolutions and resolutions about sexual violence and conflict, this is a Security Council issue. The G7 recognizes it, and it's time for the Security Council itself to recognize this. I think when hearing from the speakers, we have a very good sense of what our agenda going forward should be. We need to be pushing collectively for ceasefire. We need to be pushing for the unimpeded humanitarian access, the stay and deliver that Jan Egeland talked about. We need to be continuing to push for the Eritrean withdrawal, and we need to be scaling up the life-saving support, whether it's in terms of presence on the ground that provides certain protection, as well as capacity, or in terms of the funding. Over the longer term, there's obviously issues of impunity, but certainly Pramila has reminded us that we need to stop what's happening now as a priority, and not wait to be able to count the graves or document the rapes that took place. Administrative power, making reference to our gathering today, urged us to speak with one voice. She urged us to have a chorus, and the G7 is going to have a chorus. It will speak in one voice, and I would say that we should be speaking with one voice on the 4 issues I mentioned, as well as on some of the specific asks from our panelists today, such as the framework of cooperation that Pramila Patten mentioned. I'd also like to make reference to something that Commissioner Urpilainen and Jan Egeland have said, which are the broader tensions in Ethiopia and the broader challenges in the Horn of Africa. In essence, we need to be both addressing the immediate humanitarian catastrophe and human rights catastrophe in Tigray, while not losing sight of the broader tensions in Ethiopia and the more general challenges in the region. So we need to be continuing to push for a ceasefire, for the humanitarian access, for the Eritrean withdrawal, but we also need to be pushing the Ethiopians to develop some kind of inclusive, credible, comprehensive political process that will chart a consensual way forward to address the underlying tensions across the country. As Jan Egeland has reminded us, it is not just Tigray where there are violence and tensions and problems. It's elsewhere in Ethiopia, and there is no military solution to these issues. There's only a political solution. So even while addressing the man-made famine and the human rights catastrophe, we also need to be pushing with one voice in a unified way the Ethiopians to work together to chart a consensual way forward through a political process, not by relying exclusively on military means. I've traveled in the 8 weeks or so since I've been on the job. I've done some traveling in the Horn, as well as in the broader Red Sea area, to countries that have influence in the Horn. I've consulted widely with representatives from countries in the G7, countries beyond the G7, with our EU colleagues, etc. And what strikes me is that our analysis of the situation in Tigray, our analysis of the situation in Ethiopia more generally, our analysis of the situation in the Horn overlaps to a large extent. Today, we got a lot more details. The information that Mark Lowcock was able to provide to us, I think, just reinforces that analysis that we already share. So it is absolutely time, as previous speakers have said, to go beyond the words, to go beyond the analysis which we share, and to come up with unified, shared action to address the problems that we've identified. So I very much appreciate the fact that I've been able to listen to the speakers and the panelists today, which enrich the information that's available to me in my own discussions with the Ethiopians, the Eritreans, and others. But this doesn't change the basic analysis that I think all of us share. So now is the time to move from analysis to action, and I think that the G7 summit today will do a lot in sort of lighting a fire under the international community to respond forcefully with funding and with unified messages to those that are continuing the fight in Tigray, those that are creating the tension and violence across Ethiopia. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Special Envoy Feltman, for that. That echoes everything we've been hearing, both from Tigrayans themselves and from the panelists, from the co-hosts. Analysis isn't enough. Action is what's needed now. It is, all that's left for me now is to thank the co-hosts, to thank Administrator Samantha Power, to thank Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, to thank the commissioners, the European Union commissioners, Janez Lenarčič and Julia Urpilainen, also to thank you yourselves, the Special Envoy, for giving us our summation remarks. Thank you so much to Mark Lowcock. Thank you to Jan Egeland. Thank you to Pramila. Thank you so much for everything that you and your teams on the ground are doing. And I received one message just as we were closing up, and it is a really desperate plea on behalf of so many of those who are watching today, who have been following online, that this cannot be yet more talk, that what has been heard today, what we've heard from those whose humanitarian workers, whose agencies are on the front line, like Mark, like Jan, like Pramila, those humanitarian workers who themselves are taking huge risks, that they will be supported in addition to the support for the people of Tigray. So many people have said that they do not believe that they and their families can survive any more global inaction. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today as the host. Thank you for your comments online, and thank you everyone who took part. Have a lovely rest of your day.
ስትከታተሉት የነበረው የአሜሪካና አውሮፓ ህብረት የጋራ ከፍተኛ የክብ ጠረጴዛ ውይይት በትግራይ ላይ አተኩሮ ሲወያይ ነበር። የቀጥታ ስርጭት ነበር። የተለያዩ ሰዎች ተናግረዋል። ከተባበሩት መንግስታት
This meeting is no longer being recorded.
የተባበሩት መንግስታት የዩኤስ አምባሳደር የሆኑት ሊንዳ ቶማስ ግሪንፊልድ የእንኳን ደህና መጣችሁ ንግግር ሲያደርጉ በጣም ደጋግሞ ያነሱት የጸጥታው ምክር ቤት ይህን ነገር ለመወያየት እስካሁን ያው ክፍት ውይይት ለማድረግ ፈቃደኛ ያልሆኑ ሀገሮች ያው ራሽያን እና ቻይናን ማለታቸው ነው እያደናቀፉት እስካሁን መቆየቱ ያው የአፍሪካውያን ህይወት አይገደንም ወይ ቁብ አይሰጠንም ወይ ዋጋ አይሰጠም ወይ በማለት መክፈቻቸውን ንግግር አድርገው ነበር። ከዛ በኋላ የተለያዩ ተናጋሪዎች ተናግረዋል። ከተባበሩት መንግስታት፣ ከአውሮፓ ህብረት ኮሚሽነሮች፣ 2 ኮሚሽነሮች ተናግረዋል። ከዛ ከተለያዩ የረድኤት ድርጅቶችም ተናግረዋል። ከዩኤን ከተማድ 2 ተናግረዋል። ወደ በኋላ 4 PM ኢስተርን ታይም ተመልሰን ከፕሮፌሰር ሙልጌታ ጋር እናወራለን በዛሬው ውይይት ይዘትና በተለይ ደግሞ ነገ በሚከፈተው ቡድን 7 ሀገሮች ውይይት ምን እንደሚጠበቅ እንግዲህ ያስቀድሞ ፌልትማን እንደተናገሩት ፌልትማን ማለት ወደ አፍሪካ ቀንድ 2 ጊዜ የሄዱ ናቸው። የኢሳያስ አፈወርቂንም አብይ አህመድም አግኝተዋል። ከዛ ደግሞ በዙሪያው ኬንያ መሪዎችን አግኝተዋል። ትላንት የኬንያ መሪ ወደ ኢትዮጵያ ሄደው ነበረ። እንደምታውቁት ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ያለው መንግስት እና አማካሪዎቹ፣ ደጋፊዎቹ፣ ልሂቃን የተደረገውና የሚናገሩት ሁልጊዜ አይገጥምም እና አንዱ ኡሁሩ ኬንያታ የኬንያው ወደ አዲስ አበባ ይዘውት የሄዱት መልእክት የፌልትማንን መልእክት ነው። ምክንያቱም በሁለተኛው ዙር የአብይ መንግስት ፌልትማንን ለማግኘት ፈቃደኛ የሆነ አልመሰለኝም። መጀመሪያው የሄደ ጊዜ ግን ፌልትማን የአሜሪካ ልዩ ልዑክ በአፍሪካ ቀንድ መጀመሪያ ኢሳያስን ነበር ያገኘው። ኢሳያስን ሲያገኝ ከተነጋገሯቸው ነገሮች መካከል ስለ መውጣት ነው። አንዱ ስለ አንዱ የሚያስበውን ስለ አብይ ምን ታስባለህ ተብሎ ተጠይቋል። ኢሳያስ ለመያዝ የሚያስቸግር ህፃን ልጅ ነው ብሎ እንደተናገረ ከታማኝ ምንጭ የሚዲያ ሰምታለች እና ስለ መውጣትን በሚናገሩበት ሰዓት መውጣት እወጣለሁ፣ ነገር ግን ዝም ብሎ ያለ ማስተካከያ ከወጣው ኤርትራ ድረስ ይመጡብኛል የትግራይ ኃይሎች የሚል ፌልትማን ኢሳያስ ተናግሯል። ወደ አዲስ አበባ ሄዶ ፌልትማን ደግሞ ተመሳሳይ ጥያቄ ነው አብይን የጠየቀው። ስለ ኢሳያስ ምን ታስባለህ ባለው ሰዓት አብይ ደግሞ ያው ግራንድ ቪዥን ወይም ታላቅ ራዕይ የሌለው ሽማግሌ ነው ኢሳያስ ብሎ ወዲያው ግን የጠየቀው ስለኔ አብይ ምን አላችሁ ማነው ኢሳያስ ምን አላችሁ ብሎ ነው ፌልትማንን የጠየቀው። የከታማኝ ምንጭ የሚዲያ እንደሰማችሁ የፌልትማን እንዳለ እንደወረደ ነግሮታል። አብይ በዛ በጣም ተበሳጭቶ እንደነበረ መደበቅ የማይችለው ብስጭት እንዳሳየ ተናግሯል። ስለ መውጣትም ስለ ሌላውም ስለ ከትግራይ ኃይሎች ከቲፒኤልኤፍ ጋር መደራደርም ተነስቶለታል እና ያው እንደ ተአምር እንደ የሁሉ ነገር መፍትሄ አድርጎ የሚቆጥረው ምርጫው ሲያልፍ ይህን ሁሉ ለማድረግ ፈቃደኛ እንደሆነ ተናግሯል። እና ያው እንግዲህ ፌልትማን እዚህ ላይ ፊት ለፊት እንደምታዩት አሁን ከትንተና ከግምገማ አልፈን ወደ ተግባራዊ እርምጃ መገባት ያለበት ጊዜ ነው እና ኢትዮጵያ እና ትግራይ አጀንዳ ሆነዋል ጂ7 ማለት ነው። ቀደም ብሎ ጂ7 በሚደረግበት ጊዜ ኢትዮጵያ ትጋበዝ ነበረ። የጂ7 አባልም ባትሆን በነበራት ሚና በምታሳየው የተለያዩ በበጎ አይንም መመልከት የሚቻሉ ጉዳዮች ስለነበሩ በዓለም መንግስታት ዘንድ ትጋበዝ ነበር። አሁን ኢትዮጵያ የምትጋበዝበት ዘመን ሳይሆን ኢትዮጵያ አጀንዳ የምትሆንበት ዘመን ሆኗል በበጎ ባልሆነ መልኩ። ይሄ ደግሞ አብይ የሚሄድበት መንገድ እና ደጋፊዎቹ ልሂቃን የሚሄዱበት መንገድ ነው። በዚህ ዙሪያ ላይ ከአሌክስ ዳዋል ጋር ያደረግነው ውይይት በጣም ጠቃሚ ይመስለኛል። ከሁለት ቀን በፊት የሚዲያ ቻናል ላይ ታገኙታላችሁ። አሌክስ ዳዋል ለበርካታ ዓመታት ምናልባት ወደ 40 ዓመት ለሚጠጋ ጊዜ የአፍሪካን ቀንድ የሚያውቅ በ2015 The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa የሚል መጽሐፍ የጻፈ ነው። ያ መጽሐፍ ብዙ ጠቃሚ ትንተናዎች ያሉት እና አሁን ትግራይ ላይ ያለውን እልቂት ለምን ሊሂቁ ከኃይሌ ገብረስላሴ ከላይ እስከ ዳንኤል ክብረት ወይም እስከ ኤፍሬም እሸቴ በአደባባይ ለምን ደገፉት የሚለውን ለመረዳት የልሂቃን ፖለቲካ ላይ ያጠናው የአሌክስ ዳዋል አንስተን ተወያይተናል። እሱን ተመልከቱ። ዛሬ 4 PM ኢስተርን ታይም ግን ከፕሮፌሰር ሙሉጌታ ገብረ እግዚአብሔር ጋራ ተመልሰን መጣና የዛሬውን ውይይት ትንተና እንተነትናለን፣ ሀሳባችን እንሰጣለን። የጂ7 የነገውን ስብሰባ ደግሞ ምን እንደሚጠበቅ ሀሳባችን እናካፍላለን። የቀጥታ ስርጭት እዚህ ላይ ያበቃል። ከሚዲያ ብዙ ነገር እንዳገኛችሁበት ተስፋ አደርጋለሁ። የሚዲያ ለማስረጃ መር እና ለመረጃ ጠገብ ተዋጽኦና ውሳኔ አስተዋጽኦ ለማድረግ የሚተጋ ሚዲያ ነው። መረዳት፣ መለካት እንዲሁም መከወን ወይም ማድረግ ላይ ይሰራል። ሀሳባ ካላችሁ አካፍሉን፣ ኢሜል አድርጉልን። ማገዝ የምትፈልጉ ደግሞ ኮንታክት አድርጉን። ይህ በእንዲህ እንዳለ ነገ ደግሞ ከዚቶ ካብዌ ጋራ ውይይት እናደርጋለን። ዚቶ ካብዌ የታንዛኒያ ትልቁ የተቃዋሚ ፖለቲካ ድርጅት መሪ ነው። የአፍሪካ መንግስታትና ህብረት ምላሽ ወይም ግብረ መልስ ምን ይመስል እንደነበረ ከትግራይ ጦርነት ጋር ተያይዞ እሱን እናወራለን። ቀደም ደሞ ናይ እንዳ ገብረ ህይወት በቀጥታ ከመሐላለፊው ምስ ሓውና ዶክተር ኢሳያስ ይርጋው ዶክተር ኢሳያስ ይርጋው ኣብዚ ናይ ክብደት ምቅናስ ናይ መጥባሕቲ ዝሰርሕ በዓል ሞያ እዩ ኣብ ሂወቱ ካብ ሂወቱ መናሰይ ታይ ክማሃሩ ይኽእሉ ዳግማይ ህንፀት ትግራይ ከተመስል ኣሎ ብናቱ ኣረኣያ ዝብልን ሰርፕራይዝ ህቶታትን ህዝና ከንቀርብና ላይቭ ኣብ 4 p.m. Eastern Time ቀዳም ይኾነሎ ማለት እዩ ቀዳም ደሞ ሓድሽ መደብ ቅድመ ህዚ ሰንበት ዝቀርብ ዝነበረ ሰንበት ኣይኮነን ህዚ ዝቀርብ ኣብዚ ክረመሎ ቀዳም 9 p.m. ኣክሱም ስታንዳርድ ታይም ክንቀርብ ኢና ማለት እዩ ወይም ደሞ ቀዳም 10 p.m. ኣክሱም ኢስተርን ታይም ላይቭ ጸዋታ ኸሊ ማለት እዩ ስለዚህ እዚ መስል ነይሩ ይመስል ነበር የቀጥታ ስርጭቱ 4 p.m. Eastern Time ላይ እንገናኛለን በተለያየ መልኩ የሚዲያን ማገዝ የምትፈልጉ እንዳልኩት በኢሜል ኮንታክት አድርጉን ደሃን ወአሉታ ሰላም ዋሉ have a good one